On the night of December 29th, 1610, a Hungarian count climbed a mountain path in the freezing dark. His name was György Thurzo. He was the most powerful judicial officer in the Kingdom of Hungary, the Palatine, second only to the king himself. He had come to a place called Chachtice Castle. It sat on a sheer rock face in what is now western Slovakia. No one visited Chachtice uninvited. It belonged to one of the oldest and wealthiest families in Europe. But that night, Thurzo had come with soldiers. When they forced the door open, what they found inside would become one of the most infamous crime scenes in human history. In one room, a young woman was lying on the floor. Her body had been drained of blood. Her skin was already turning gray. In another room, another girl, still alive, but barely. Her hands were burned. Her fingers had been broken. Beneath the castle, in the cellars, the soldiers found shallow graves. The official record says Thurzo found the bodies of at least one girl dead, one dying, and several more locked away in cells. He claimed to have interrupted a torture session in progress. Over the next 12 months, 300 witnesses would be interviewed. One number would emerge from those testimonies, a number so large it would earn a place in the Guinness Book of World Records 4 centuries later. 650 girls. That is how many young women the owner of Chachtice Castle was said to have murdered. Her name was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, and according to history, she killed them so she could bathe in their blood and stay young forever. But here is the thing nobody tells you about Elizabeth Báthory. Almost none of that is true. To understand what actually happened at Chachtice, you need to understand who this woman was before the night Thurzo broke down her door. She was born on August 7th, 1560, in a town called Nyírbátor in the Kingdom of Hungary. Her full name was Erzsébet Báthory. The Báthorys were not just wealthy, they were one of the most powerful families in Europe. Her uncle was the King of Poland, her cousin was the Prince of Transylvania, her bloodline controlled vast swaths of Eastern Europe. Elizabeth was raised in luxury. She received the kind of education almost no woman of her time ever received. She spoke 4 languages fluently: Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. She could read and write at a level that embarrassed most of the noblemen around her. By every surviving account from her childhood, she was considered beautiful. Dark hair, pale skin, sharp features. She was also, from a very young age, exposed to extreme violence. She had epileptic seizures starting at the age of 4. At 6, she watched a public execution. At 10, she reportedly witnessed a Romani man being sewn alive into the belly of a dying horse as punishment for theft. His head was left sticking out so the spectators could hear him scream. This was not unusual in the Hungary of 1570. Violence against the lower classes was not illegal. It was entertainment. At 11 years old, Elizabeth was engaged. At 15, she was married. Her husband's name was Count Ferenc Nadasdy. He was 5 years older than her, a soldier, a warrior, a man so feared by the Ottoman Empire that they gave him a nickname, the Black Knight of Hungary. When Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy in 1575, he gave her a wedding gift, a castle. Its name was Chachtice. It sat on a mountain in the far western reaches of Hungary, remote, isolated, perfect for a young noblewoman who needed somewhere to rule while her husband was away at war. And Ferenc was almost always away at war. He spent most of their marriage leading Hungarian armies against the Ottomans. When he did come home, he brought his wife gifts, but not the kind most husbands brought. According to the historical record, Ferenc taught his young wife how to torture servants. He gave her a pair of gloves with metal claws sewn into them, a tool for punishing maids who made mistakes. He is also said to have built her a torture chamber in the castle, a private room, underground, where she could discipline her servants without the household watching. This is where the story begins to twist. Because in the Hungary of 1600, what Ferenc and Elizabeth did behind closed doors was not a crime. Servants were considered property. A noblewoman could beat a servant girl to death and face no consequence at all. Some historians have written that servant mortality on noble estates during this period was simply accepted as the cost of running a household. But Elizabeth went further than most. After Ferenc died in 1604, the rumors grew louder. Young women who had been sent to Chatice to work as maids were not coming home. Girls who had left their villages with contracts of employment were never heard from again. Elizabeth established what she called a gynecium, a finishing school for the daughters of the lesser nobility. Wealthy but less powerful families would send their girls to Chaktiche to learn courtly manners before marriage. Some of those girls also disappeared. And when the daughters of nobles started disappearing, the authorities finally began to pay attention. A local Lutheran pastor named Istvan Magyari wrote letters complaining about the rumors. Peasants began to whisper about what was happening inside the castle walls. The local priest at Chaktice claimed he was being asked to bury more bodies than a village that size should have produced. By 1609, the complaints had reached the court of King Matthias II of Hungary. The king ordered an investigation. He appointed the most powerful legal officer in the kingdom to conduct it, Count György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary. He was also Elizabeth Báthory's cousin. Thurzo spent over a year gathering evidence. He interviewed locals, priests, former servants. He collected what he later described as 300 individual testimonies. And on the night of December 29th, 1610, he made his move. He arrived at Chaktice with a small force of soldiers. What happened next became the founding myth of Elizabeth Báthory's legend. According to the official account, Thurzo caught her in the act. He found dead and dying girls inside the castle. He claimed one girl's body was already stiff, another was still bleeding from fresh wounds. Several more were locked in cells in the cellars. He immediately placed Elizabeth under house arrest. She could not be jailed like a commoner. Her status forbade it, but he locked her inside her own chambers and turned his attention to her servants. 4 of them were arrested, 3 women and 1 man. Dorothea Sentes, a washerwoman. Ilona Joe, Elizabeth's former wet nurse, the woman who had fed Elizabeth's own children. Katarina Benica, a laundress. And a young man named János Újvári, known to everyone by his nickname Fichko. All 4 were taken to the town of Bitcha. All 4 were tortured. Their interrogators used a technique pioneered by the Catholic Inquisition. The same questions were asked of each prisoner separately. Then the answers were cross-referenced to see which ones matched. Under that torture, they confessed. They described methods that are difficult to speak aloud even now. Girls beaten with clubs until the soles of their feet bled. Girls stripped naked and forced to stand outside in winter until they froze to death. Girls burned with red-hot irons. Girls whose fingers were sliced off for sewing mistakes. Girls held down while Elizabeth bit pieces of flesh from their throats and shoulders. The servants said Elizabeth had a sickness, that she could not function unless she was hurting someone. They said she kept a private book. In that book, she recorded the names of her victims. When asked how many names were in the book, one servant said a court official had seen it once. That official claimed the book contained 650 names. The trial began on January 2nd, 1611. Elizabeth herself was not permitted to attend. She was not allowed to defend herself. She was not allowed to question the witnesses. Everything happened without her. Her servants were convicted. Ilona Yo and Dorothea Sentes were sentenced to have their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers and then to be burned alive. János Újvári, because he was young and believed to be less culpable, was given a less painful death. He was beheaded first, and his body was burned afterward on the same fire as the 2 women. Katarina Benica was spared execution. Evidence showed the other servants had been bullying her. She was given life imprisonment instead. And Elizabeth was walled up. In one of her own castles, a room was sealed shut with bricks. Only a small slit was left for food and another for ventilation. She remained inside that room for 3 years, 7 months, and 3 weeks. On August 21st, 1614, a guard looked through the slit and found her dead on the floor. She was 54 years old. That is the story everyone knows. Now here is the story almost nobody tells. In 1817, more than 200 years after the trial, a researcher was permitted to examine the sealed court documents for the first time. What that researcher found has troubled historians ever since. Of the 300 witness statements Thurzo collected, only a fraction contained anything that could be called evidence. Modern scholars have now examined those records in detail. Their conclusions are disturbing. Of the 289 witnesses whose testimonies were recorded in full, more than 250 offered nothing but hearsay. They had not seen anything. They had heard things from someone who had heard things from someone else. A researcher named Irma Sadecki-Kardos examined the Hungarian medical texts of the period and found that many of the tortures described by witnesses were identical to legitimate medical procedures used at the time. Bloodletting, cauterization, forced immersion in cold water, treatments for conditions the servants might not have understood. The number 650, that famous record-breaking number, where did it come from? It came from a single witness, a servant girl named Susanna. She did not claim to have seen the book herself. She said a court official named Jakub Silvasi had once told her he had seen the figure in one of Elizabeth's private books. That court official never testified. The book was never produced in court. The book has never been found. Every modern count of Elizabeth Báthory's victims traces back to that single secondhand claim. A woman heard a man say he saw a number in a book. The man refused to come forward. The book disappeared. And there is more. Gheorghe Thurzo, the investigator, was not a neutral party. He was Elizabeth's cousin. He controlled every step of the investigation, every witness selection, every confession under torture. He personally chose which testimonies would be recorded and which would be ignored. When the trial began, Thurzo convinced the king that Elizabeth should not be publicly executed. The official reason was that it would disgrace the nobility. The unofficial consequence was that no public proceedings would ever occur, no cross-examination, no appeal, no chance for anyone to challenge the evidence. Her confession was never recorded. Her version of events was never documented. The records were sealed immediately after her conviction and remained sealed for over 200 years. The servants who testified against her had been tortured for days before their confessions were extracted. Their statements contradicted each other on fundamental details. The number of victims one servant admitted to burying ranged from 36 to 51. None of them knew where the 650 number came from. This is not how trials normally worked, even in 1611. Something else was happening. Here is what nobody tells you about Elizabeth Báthory. Her husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, was not just a soldier. He was one of the wealthiest men in Hungary. When he died in 1604, he left behind enormous debts owed to his family by the crown itself. Specifically, King Matthias II owed the Báthory estate a sum of money so large that paying it back would have bankrupted the royal treasury. The king did not want to pay, and under Hungarian law at the time, if a noble was convicted of a capital crime, their estate could be seized by the crown. All debts owed to them would be cancelled. All their lands, their castles, their cash reserves, their legal claims against the king, everything would revert to the throne. The king had a reason. Thurzo had a reason too. He was a cousin of the Báthorys, which meant he had a claim on their estates if Elizabeth's line was broken. When the investigation ended, Thurzo was granted stewardship of much of Elizabeth's land. Elizabeth was the most powerful, unmarried noblewoman in the Kingdom of Hungary, a widow in charge of her own vast fortune. She had no husband to control her, no father to answer to. Her sons and daughters-in-law were already pushing for access to her estates before the investigation even began. Now, think about the evidence. A cousin with financial motive runs the investigation. The king who ordered the investigation owes her money. Her own family members stand to inherit if she is convicted. 250 witnesses offer nothing but rumor. The famous number comes from a missing book and an absent official. Her servants are tortured until they confess to things that happen to match standard medical procedures of the era. She is never allowed to speak in her own defense. The records are sealed for 2 centuries. Is this justice? Or is this a family wiping out its most inconvenient relative? Here is the part that is hardest to accept. The honest answer to the Elizabeth Báthory question is that she was probably guilty of something and almost certainly not guilty of what history accuses her of. She was cruel. Several legitimate sources document her abuse of servants well before Thurzo arrived. A Lutheran pastor in 1602 wrote a letter describing her excessive cruelty. Some servant girls probably did die on her estates under horrific circumstances. In the Hungary of 1610, that was not a crime a noblewoman could be prosecuted for, but it was real. She may have had a mental illness. Modern historians have speculated about epileptic rage, which she is known to have suffered from since childhood. Others have pointed to generations of intermarriage within the Báthory family, which produced well-documented patterns of mental instability in her relatives. But the 650, the ritualistic torture, the bathing in blood, that is not history, that is propaganda. The blood-bathing legend does not appear anywhere in the original trial records. Not a single witness in 1611 said Elizabeth Báthory bathed in blood. Not one. The story was first written down in 1729 by a Hungarian priest named László Töröcsi. That is 115 years after her death, long after everyone who had known her was buried. The story of Bram Stoker's Dracula being inspired by her? Also invented. Scholars have thoroughly dismantled that claim. Stoker almost certainly never read about Báthory. The connection was manufactured by later writers looking for a vampire origin story. Everything iconic about Elizabeth Báthory, the bloodbaths, the 650 victims, the inspiration for Dracula, almost all of it was added after she was already dead by people who had political or literary reasons to make her a monster. So what was she really? She was probably an abusive noblewoman in an era when abuse of servants was legal. She probably killed some of them. The real number is likely somewhere between 30 and 80, matching the actual convictions at her trial. Still horrifying, still criminal by any modern standard, but human scale, she was also almost certainly the victim of one of the most successful political smear campaigns in European history. A powerful widow destroyed by a king who owed her money, a cousin who wanted her estates, and a family that could not let her die with her fortune intact. History did not just record Elizabeth Báthory. History built her. And that is the real story. Not a monster who bathed in blood. A woman whose monstrousness was magnified 400-fold because she was inconvenient to the people around her, and the people around her controlled who got to speak and what got written down. 400 years later, she is still a Guinness World Record holder for a murder count that was almost certainly fabricated. So here is the question I want you to sit with tonight. Elizabeth Báthory, real killer or scapegoat? Was she a sadistic aristocrat who murdered hundreds of girls for pleasure? Or was she a difficult, probably cruel, probably guilty woman whose crimes were exaggerated 1,000 times over by a state that wanted her gone? Or, and this is the part that matters, was she both? Drop your answer in the comments. If you want to know what history's darkest secrets really mean, subscribe. New video every week.